And one more piece of background information. I've known Jeff Brain, who excavated the Fort St. George site for 53 years or so. He got me started as a lab rat and he's helping him out in the lab in the mid-1970s. This level well-drained land upon which Fort St. George was built and the beach where Virginia was constructed had been used by Native Americans or indigenous peoples for thousands of years prior to 1607. I will use indigenous and Native American terminology interchangeably. Jeff Brain's excavation at Fort St. George recovered hundreds of stone tools and thousands of pieces of pottery, bucket loads, literally, of flakes of stone from making stone tools, and encountered a few intact bits of pre-Fort St. George archaeological deposit. However, most of the indigenous materials were recovered from soils that had been disturbed by Fort St. George construction. So the Europeans arrived and mucked up the landscape. Native Americans or indigenous peoples have been living in what is now Maine for 13,000 years, 13,000, since the end of the last ice age. I will begin tonight by presenting a picture of Native American life just before Europeans arrived, and then we will look at environmental change, cultural and technological changes from the end of the ice age to European arrival, and toward the end of the presentation I will summarize what we know about the archaeology of indigenous use of the Fort St. George area and the mouth of the Kennebec before the fort was built. Can people see the slides all right? Okay, good. We have a reasonable picture of indigenous life in Maine as it was just before Europeans arrived from, say, 1000 AD to 1600 AD. This picture is derived from Wabanaki traditional stories, archaeological information, and the records of the earliest European explorers and settlers written before the effects of European diseases, encroaching settlement, and warfare drastically altered indigenous life. Indigenous people in what is now Maine were hunters, fishers, and gatherers who moved seasonally along the coast and across the interior waterways in birch bark canoes during open water season. Along the coast, people operated tidal fish weirs, we think. We've got good evidence. They collected clams, hunted and moved seasonally to places of concentrated seasonal fish runs, fish migrations. In the interior, during winter, they put the canoes up and they moved on snowshoes, pulling toboggans. Along the Maine coast from roughly Booth Bay and Pemaquid south and west, Native American families planted corn, beans, and squash in small gardens during the summer and supplemented their wild food sources. We actually have a charred bean fragment from an Indian fire hearth dated 1400 AD at Pemaquid, from an indigenous fire hearth that survived underneath the colonists there who built the Pemaquid colony. Pemaquid was likely the easternmost indigenous agricultural village on the coast of Maine. The lower Kennebec River and Casco Bay, and thus the Fort St. George location, were definitely within the area of southwestern Maine where corn, bean, and squash agriculture supplemented wild food gathering, wild food sources, at least when Europeans arrived. This is a pretty decent reconstruction of the interior of a wigwam, birch bark covered wigwam that was at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor for a long time. Before Europeans arrived, cooking was done in ceramic pots set into or next to an open fire, as you can see here. Tools were made of stone, bone, and wood. Birch bark was used extensively for containers and covering dwellings, as well as for construction of canoes. Birch bark, in some ways, was their plastic. You could do all kinds of stuff with it. Cordage and woven objects such as mats were made of reeds, bark, fiber, finer plant fibers such as nettle. Clothing was mostly skin, deer skins and furs. There was no Native American stone architecture, and there was no earthen mound building in Maine. Houses were constructed in several forms, generally built with bark covering over a pole frame that was lashed together. The poles were lashed together with fiber of some kind. In southern New England, and perhaps southernmost Maine, the bark of elm and other species was used for their shingle covering. There's some woven mats on the wigwam in the background in this picture. But birch bark was most conveniently used across most of Maine. These camp or village sites were seasonal, but sometimes they were multi-seasonal. For example, fall, winter, and spring. And there are a couple of sites in Maine where people use them year-round on the coast, but whether it was all time year-round, we don't really know. The camp or village sites were reused many times over. We suspect that house frames and some camp furniture, such as stone fire hearth rings, were left in place when people moved seasonally. And we think there was some control of vegetation cover, maybe annual burning or something that kept these camping places in fairly decent shape. The concept of a landscape location as a designated campsite is perfectly familiar to those of us today who use the Maine state parks or who go camping, for example, in the Allagash or the North Maine woods. People have been there before. They're improved somehow already a little bit, and so you can just move onto the site and be comfortable. To paraphrase Dr. Bonnie Newsom, who's now an archaeology professor at the University of Maine and former Penobscot Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, archaeological sites are important repositories of scientific and anthropological information, but they also carry important heritage and social value as well for the indigenous peoples of Maine. For Maine's indigenous peoples, quote, archaeological sites are remains of the remnants of their built heritage. It's just like our historic landscapes to them. Many of the archaeology projects in Maine today, by the way, are undertaken collaboratively with Maine's tribes and or in consultation with tribal historic preservation officers. There's at least 3 or 4 tribal members who are now archaeologists. Just before Europeans arrived, we estimate that about 25,000 Native Americans made their living in what is now the state of Maine. When you think about it, that's a fairly high number. We make this estimate based on European account of Maine villages and the number of warriors in each village derived from about 1605, before the indigenous populations were decimated by introduced European diseases and colonial warfare. The source of this information is Thomas Purchas's account, published in 1625. The majority of Native Americans in what is now Maine lived on or near the coast year-round, including winter. They were on the coast during winter. And the coast provided shellfish and some other reliable resources that made it fairly easy to live there as opposed to the interior. Some groups probably lived on and around the large interior lakes basins in northern Maine. For example, there was probably a group living around Moosehead, some people living around what's now Ripogenis and the Rangeley Lakes. But everyone traveled during the summertime. Everyone traveled easily in their bark canoes. during open water season and visited or traded back and forth across Maine and the Maritimes provinces. There's a historic record of an Indian courier taking a set of diplomatic documents from Boston to Quebec City, I don't know, sometime in the late 18th century. Took him 10 days in his bark canoe to go from Boston to Quebec. It's pretty rapid travel. This is Samuel de Champlain's schematic map of the indigenous village of what is now Bedford and Saco. You can see Bedford Pool down here on the lower left. Note that the settlement pattern is dispersed over a large area with perhaps a central village with small seasonal farmsteads or wigwams and cornfields scattered about. Please keep this image in mind when considering that Purchas's account of 1605 states that on the river Sagadahoc, the first village is Kennebec with 80 houses and 100 men. And the Sagamore's name was Apamhoman. So the village with a population of about 500 to 800 people was recorded in the lower Kennebec region somewhere between Bath and the Sagadahoc River area. We haven't found it yet. Maybe it's underneath Bath Ironworks. I don't know, but there were quite a number of people right around here, including the Fort St. George landscape. There are about 200 prehistoric Native American or pre-European archaeological sites in and around Upper Casco Bay and the mouth of the Kennebec. There's the Kennebec. Right? Yep. I'm showing you these maps to give you an impression of the density of the archaeological sites. We have more precise archaeological site location information, but we present it in this way with quarter-mile squares for general use, primarily to protect the sites from looting and landowners from intrusion. That's a subject for a different lecture. Almost all of the sites shown here and elsewhere along the tidal coast and estuaries of Maine are on the shore, clinging to the uneroded soil that is just above the wash of the storm tide. The majority of these coastal sites are small, less than an acre in size, and contain discarded shellfish shells in layers, mostly less than a foot or 2 deep. We call them shell middens. Midden is a word borrowed from Danish, meaning dump or garbage deposit. These sites were campsites, often with layers of material that record 100, several hundred, or even thousands of years from bottom to top. The shell, discarded from harvesting clams mostly, but also some oysters and mussels, neutralizes Maine's naturally acid soil and preserves bone. This excellent preservation of bone is archaeologically rare in Maine and happens only on the coast where shell was also deposited. Food animal bone, the codfish shown here in the lower right, bone tools, stone tools, pottery, fire hearths, and charcoal, and other material that we use to reconstruct the past are locked away in these shell midden sites. I want to emphasize that these coastal sites are our best storehouses of past environmental information and information about Native American coastal hunting and fishing. The sea level rise is destroying them at an accelerating rate. The storm of 2 winters ago that wiped out a lot of coastal Maine infrastructure, docks and so forth, also probably wiped out several hundred square yards of coastal shell heaps. There aren't enough archaeologists out there digging. Okay, the modern tribes in and around Maine today include Abenaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and the Mi'kmaq, formerly pronounced Micmac. Collectively, these people call themselves Wabanaki, loosely translated as people of the dawn or first light. They speak a closely related dialects, several closely related dialects, or languages of the Algonquian language family. Algonquian is shown here in pink. I can't say whether the people living at Fort St. George, the landscape of Fort St. George in 1600, were more closely related to the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy or the Abenaki. Likely there are descendants, direct descendants, living among all three tribes. We archaeologists are fairly sure that Indians, Native Americans in Maine, back to about 2,400 years ago, spoke an Algonquian language closely related to the modern tribes' languages. In part, this conclusion is based on shared root words in various Algonquian languages that occur across the Maritimes and Maine and as far west as the Ojibwe here north of the Great Lakes. So there's a bunch of closely related languages right there. And the root words, for example, that show up in this language, all these languages, are moose, birch bark, and assorted other words like porcupine that geographically locates the origin of all these related languages to the area between north of the Great Lakes and the Maritimes. Also, at the time I cited, 2,400 years ago, there was a unified ceramic pot decorating style that was clearly connecting all these people at the time. So that's why I say we're pretty sure that these languages and the people's ancestry goes back to at least 2,400 years ago. But we cannot be sure about the distant past. Tracing cultural connections between the archaeological past and the modern tribes living in Maine is difficult, except for that last 2,400 years. Thus, we don't know what languages people spoke of in the distant past or what names they called themselves. This is a timeline of our tools in Maine, beginning at 13,000 years over here and ending up with European contact here. The Native American style of life with bark canoes, bows and arrows, ceramic pots that I described at the beginning of this lecture is at most 2,000 years old or so, right in here. And I'll get into the details of the technological changes later. Cultural and environmental change has occurred many times in Maine's past, and we have only the dimmest glimpses of what came before. We've assigned names to these cultures, identified time periods they serve as communication shorthand among archaeologists. We document the changes in technological capabilities of the people who lived here, changes in their food gathering patterns as the environment changed, changes in art style, and changes in religion, for example, as expressed in rock art and burial practices. Now I'm going to switch gears, and we're going to transport ourselves back to the end of the Ice Age. And I'm going to look at how cultures and the environment in Maine has changed as we progress toward the present. So we jump back to the end of the Ice Age, as I said. The environment in Maine then was analogous to northern Labrador today. In other words, subarctic. Patches of tundra and grassland, isolated spruce trees, open spruce larch fir forest, small remnant patches of ice caps in the highest mountains, continental ice sheet here had pulled back to north of the St. Lawrence. Here's Newfoundland, with Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Maine. Also, sea levels were lower, so there was more land exposed in the shallow inshore waters. The St. Lawrence and Champlain basins here were all saltwater, cold saltwater sea, loaded with codfish, whales, and seals. We know from the fossils. So Maine and Lake Champlain formed later as the land rose, cut off the sea. But so Maine and the Maritimes provinces was this peninsula that was stuck in the middle of this cold North Atlantic Ocean. The first people to move into Maine, we call them Paleo-Indians. They moved into Maine about 13,000 years ago, probably from the lower Hudson Valley. They crossed. You can't get into Maine except right through here. So they brought some stones with them from the Hudson. So we know they were the first summer people to come into Maine from New York, basically. They were Indians. They're most closely genetically related. They were descendants of people who crossed Bering Land Bridge, either by land or by sea, from Northeast Asia. They were Indians most closely genetically related to modern Indians in South America. They made their living, at least for some seasons of the year, by hunting caribou and perhaps the last of the mammoth and mastodon. And they moved seasonally on foot over vast areas of the interior Northeast. Okay, we don't know much about life on the Maine coast in this very distant past because one of the ongoing ecological changes that has continually affected Maine since the end of the Ice Age, relative sea level change. This is a confusing graph, but 0 here is modern sea level. And this is a time scale down here. And this is where the shoreline was relative to modern sea level beginning at the end of the last ice age. The sea level has not been constant. Causes are a complex interaction of actual worldwide sea level change as the glaciers melt and change in the elevation of Maine's coastal bedrock as the weight of the last continental ice sheet was removed. The maximum, so the ice melts and the land of Maine is depressed. The sea floods in to where the ice was. And that's why there's all kinds of clay and silt and sand over interior Maine all the way up to Millinocket and the river valleys. And then because the weight of the ice has been removed, the crustal bedrock rebounds. It lifts up. And then, so about 12,500, 13,000 years ago, that effect was at its maximum. And the shoreline at that time, when the Paleo-Indians arrived, is now about 200 feet underwater off the coast. Since then, and this is an odd fact, but the bedrock is acting like a sponge or a spring, and it's been sinking ever since. So that 200-foot exposure offshore has been slowly and rapidly or slowly at times flooded as the bedrock has sunk and the sea level has come in again. That means that the shoreline has been coming inland, relatively speaking, since the first Indians arrived here. So all of the archaeological sites of people living on the shoreline and doing ocean-related stuff from the ancient times are now underwater, eroded and underwater. Here's what the coast looked like at 12,000 years ago. Relative sea level was about 120 feet down. That's what this red line here is. I apologize for this whiteness. That's just that's just a flaw in the air photo. Here's Maine Bay. Here's the Kennebec. There's Popham. There's Seguin Island. 12,000 years ago, the coast was out here. The Kennebec was a river that continued across this landform, and Seguin Island was a top of a hill on the end of a peninsula. As I said, 12,000 years ago roughly was the time of the Paleo-Indians. There's one recognizable Paleo-Indian spear point from Georgetown, Maine. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly where it came from, but it tells us the Paleo-Indians were walking over the landscape at 11 to 12,000 years ago. So it's just that when they were standing on a hill top that we think now is right looking over the sea, they were several miles from the coast. And another major source of paleo-environmental change has been climate and the terrestrial or onshore forest cover. Pollen grains and other debris layered in the bottom of lakes, for example, have been used to reconstruct both the vegetation cover and the freshwater lake levels across the 13,000 years or so since the end of the Ice Age. This is schematic, but it gives you a general idea of the changes in pollen frequencies. The climate warmed up quickly after about 11,000 years ago. Forest tree species filled in across Maine rapidly. Trees actually migrate, or rather their seeds migrate. So Maine became forested quickly. Maine indigenous people have lived in a dense forest cover since about 10,000 years ago. For a long time, perhaps 9,000 to 5,000 years ago, the climate was warmer than it is today and drier. The lake levels were lower, freshwater levels were lower. The forest had more hardwood in it. It was more like southern New England's forest, more nut-bearing trees, fewer softwoods. The climate around the Gulf of Maine has cooled down considerably in the last 3,000 years from this warm period. Some of that change is a localized effect that I'll get into in a minute, with cold, deep water coming in to the Gulf of Maine. But for a long time, it was warmer and drier than it is now, until the last 3,000 years or so. And now, of course, climate change is reversing the cooling trend, and we're going, I don't know how long it's going to take us to get back to the circa 5,000 years old, warmer, drier climate, but we can feel those changes. There's one more major ecological change before returning to archaeology, and that is sea level rise. The tides caused by sea level rise. Until about 3,500 years ago or so, the Gulf of Maine had low tides, maybe a foot or two difference between high and low tide. That allowed the development of a warm surface water layer in the summer and reinforced the warmer climate on shore. As sea level rose over the thousands of years, geologists think that the rising water finally broke through a pile of glacial dirt until at the western end of the Maine Basin, the eastern Bay of Fundy. About 3,500 years ago, this flooded out and opened up the whole eastern end of the Bay of Fundy. And that change in the geometry of the Gulf of Maine allowed the tides to resonate closely with the 12.5-hour solar-lunar cycle. And that resonance is what rapidly and dramatically increased the tidal range to 8 to 13 feet, or whatever we see now. A change in low tidal amplitude of 1 to 2 feet to high tide range of 8 or more feet may have occurred rapidly in a century or two. It was a very drastic change, about 3,500 years ago. That high tide range now drives an upwelling of current in the Gulf of Maine and a cold water current, and ultimately derived from the Labrador current, comes around the tip of Nova Scotia and upwells along the coast of Maine, especially eastern Gulf of Maine. And that's why we have the uncomfortably cold swimming water that we have today. But that cold water and summer fog, that cold water plus the high tide amplitude is what causes our coastal ecology that we have today. Broad clam flats, inshore fisheries, used to be inshore fisheries, and seals and all the seabirds. So the ecology we look at today has only been here for maybe 3,000 years. Remember this timeline again. So all the evidence of coastal use of the coast from about 3,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago back, well, it's actually more like 4,000 years ago. There's a few sites with basal shell-midden layers dating to 4,000 years ago that survive around Penobscot Bay and a few in Casco Bay. So everything that's older than 4,000 years is underwater. How do we know what was going on at the time? Scallop draggers. One source of information we have, and basically the only one, are artifacts dragged up by scallop draggers, and when they do their dragging, they know where their drag is. So when they find an artifact, a lot of them have shared the artifacts finds with archaeologists. So we get a record of what's out there on the coast, on the Gulf of Maine, from the fishermen themselves. Remember, out to 200 feet depth was dry land, and people could inhabit it at some time during the past. For example, on the right-hand side of the slide here is a spear point from halfway, a ledge off Halfway Rock in outer Casco Bay. It's about 5,000 years old based on the style. If you look at the bathymetry, the chart of Halfway Rock, you can see that when sea level was 10 feet lower, roughly, at 5,000 years ago, Halfway Rock was like a 10-acre island. And substantially larger than it is today. Presumably 5,000 years ago, it supported grass and trees and enough area to camp and visit seasonally by canoe for hunting or fishing or something, and that stone point was dropped out there. Now it's just a rock with a lighthouse on top of it. What would the lower Kennebec on the coast have looked like, say, 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, with sea level lower by 15 to 20 feet? Basically, the same landforms were there. The long peninsulas, they dominate the landscape or seascape of mid-coast Maine, but what are now offshore islands were then part of the peninsulas. This map on the right, oops, did I skip a slide? I skipped a slide, sorry. So this map, on this map, the blue highlight is the extent of tidal range at 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. Miramichi Bay, where we are now, and the head of tide was somewhere around the head of the Sassanova River. The same over here in Casco Bay, Sheepscot, Damerscotta. The head of tide on the Kennebec was somewhere near Bath. Miramichi Bay was a freshwater body, a confluence of multiple rivers, and presumably the chops right there, which was still a constriction for water flow, must have been one heck of a massive freshwater waterfall at the time. So what's happened basically over time is the bedrock is sunk, and the tide, influence of tide, as the bedrock sinks and relative sea level rises, the tide just creeps up these estuaries and floods out falls and so forth, sequentially, one after the other over time, over thousands of years. Oops, sorry, I'm getting lost. Based on the style of spear points recovered by Jeff and Fort St. George excavation, people first used the Fort St. George landscape around 7,500 years ago to 6,000 years ago. These 2 points in the lower left are that age. And the Kennebec River was tidal, but at a lower level, 30 feet lower at 7,500 years ago, and about 15 feet lower at 6,000. So if you look at the bathymetry, the edge of the Kennebec was right there. And it was a good long ways from the edge of the tidewater to the site where these people were living. Use of the Fort St. George landform might have been a winter seasonal camp, or perhaps a special use camp focusing on nut-bearing trees, or maybe on freshwater marsh resources. Atkins Bay was not, there was some kind of a stream, must have been some kind of a stream flowing through it, and who knows how much of that was marsh. Maybe a lake basin in there, a little lake. Back to our timeline again. I've told you the oldest Maine coastal sites that survive with shell heaps are about 4,000 years old. Right here we see the tail end of that ecology just before the change to the colder water and the higher tide amplitude. We were fairly certain that those people used dugout canoes as their primary transportation for thousands of years, but up to about 3,000 years ago. Some of that evidence is a number of large stone woodworking tools, adzes, axes, and gouges made out of stone. You can replicate them with a 19th century shipwrights tools or a housewright's tools made out of steel in terms of cutting wood and scarfing pieces of wood together. Those heavy woodworking tools have been around since 9,000 years ago until about 3,000 years ago. And based on a number of excavations of these older shell middens in the 4,000 year time range, just before the tide range, the 4,000 year time range, just before tidal amplitude increased, coastal people of about 4,000 years ago were using dugout canoes and harpoons, toggling harpoons on foreshafts to go swordfish hunting. Their sites are loaded with swordfish, presumably summertime when the swordfish would come inshore. They also went longline fishing with plummet-shaped weights and probably hooks baited with clams. Codfish love clams. So the surface water was warm enough. Swordfish swam in among the islands. And what do we see at Fort St. George 4,000 years ago? There is one of those plummet-shaped fishing weights from that time period. And a couple of these stone points also date to about 4,000 years ago. So the Fort St. George landscape landform was used beginning 7,500, used up through this time period just before the change in the water regime. And then recall that 3,000 years ago we got an increase in tidal mixing cold with water, and tidal amplitude increased, and the high tide range allowed Maine's indigenous peoples to make an easy living on the coast. Very easy living. They harvested shellfish on the enlarged tidal flats, and they built intertidal fish weirs. We haven't found any of them, but we know from the assemblages of fish bones in their archaeological sites, shell middens, that they're collecting some mostly immature fish that would swim inshore into the tidal flat, including flounder, sculpin, sturgeon, the occasional salmon, and other fish. This long discussion brings us to 2,500 years ago, and I'm going to talk mostly about the technological changes that happened from then until Europeans arrived. The birch canoe was apparently introduced or invented in the region sometime around 3,000 years ago and replaced the heavy dugout canoes. Part of the evidence involves the disappearance of those heavy woodworking stone tools, and the rest of the evidence is the distribution of archaeological sites across interior Maine where birch canoes can go, but dugout canoes cannot go, such as the smaller rivers and streams. And there's a switch to smaller woodworking tools at around between 2,500 and 3,000 years ago. If you know anything about canoeing, the birch canoe was a beneficial effect on the ease of transportation among what by then were the Algonquian-speaking tribes living in Maine and the Maritimes provinces. Travel and load carrying capacity increased dramatically, in part because of the ease of upstream travel using a pole and the ease in portaging across carries, as shown here by Winslow Homer. This is a Winslow Homer watercolor, and I presume that is his Penobscot guide, I would guess, somewhere in the interior of Maine. In addition, the archaeological record records the long-distance transport of raw materials of certain types of stone increases dramatically, mostly being brought down from Bay of Fundy into Maine, but also from southern New England. Another technological change, and this occurred about 2,800 years ago. Maine Native Americans adopted or borrowed from further south the making of fired clay pottery. As a result, we archaeologists call the time more recent than 2,800 years ago the ceramic period. It's not a very inventive name, but it's easy to remember. Before ceramic technology was adopted, cooking, for example, soup, liquid, would have been done with bark or wooden containers and dropping hot rocks into it was fairly labor intensive. Ceramics made life easier. It was a labor-saving kitchen device, and it probably allowed cooking of some things that were not easy to cook before it was adopted. Before about 500 AD, or 1,500 years ago, projectile hunting was done with a throwing spear, known today by the word atlatl. It's a relatively cumbersome method, and the points used on the spears are relatively large. The bow and arrow was introduced to North America about 4,000 years ago, or 2000 BC, from Siberia into the high Arctic, and it took millennia for the technology to diffuse southward, reaching the Northeast here, maybe 500 to 700 AD. This staged photo, in 1870, shows probably, I believe he's Mi'kmaq, and a reconstructed wigwam and his bow and arrow. So how do we know when the bow and arrow arrived? There's a certain upper limit on the weight you can put a stone point you can put on the end of an arrow. It goes like this if it's over a certain weight. After 700 AD, points got smaller and lighter, better made in some cases, and materials of bone bone and other materials were also used for arrow points. Finally, as I said at the beginning, corn, bean, and squash gardening was used in southern Maine. That's the last technological adaptation that happened, that came into Maine. And the Fort St. George landform was within the range of agriculture. So, with the arrival of ceramics, and the appearance of birch bark canoes sometime around 2,500 years ago, plus or minus. Seasonal use of the Fort St. George landform increases. People started using it quite a bit. And one can imagine birch canoes pulled up on the beach here where Virginia was built. Sea level was near modern levels, maybe a foot or so, maybe a foot lower than it is today. The environment was cooling down and becoming wetter. Typical summer fog and mixed softwood hardwood forest familiar to us today was here. And I presume the landform was heavily forested except for the area used for camping. We archaeologists recognize a succession of ceramic vessel decorative designs on the exterior and manufacturing styles, and we number them ceramic periods 1 through 7, again beginning 2,800 years ago. Ceramic period 6 and 7 occupies the last few centuries before European arrival, say AD 1400 to 1600. There are thousands of indigenous ceramic potsherd fragments from the Fort St. George dig. We sorted the biggest and best of them into 86 different ceramic pot lots. You can sort them by temper and thickness and design. So there were at least 86 different pots broken on that landscape over 2,000 plus years. They cover the entire ceramic period range beginning 2,800 years ago, more or less in equal proportions over time. Thus, the Wabanaki ancestors used the Fort St. George landform on a regular basis for millennia before 1607. The most recent CP 6 and 7 ceramics, which are the last 200 years, are slightly more common than the earlier ones, so seasonal use of the location may be increased and was ongoing up until years or a season or who knows, very short period of time before the European colonists arrived. There are also appropriate stone tools from the ceramic period occupation in the collection from the Fort St. George dig. There are a few odd artifacts, also likely ceramic period, including a clay tobacco pipe. These people grew tobacco. They introduced it, the Europeans in Virginia, and saved the Virginia colony financially, blah, blah, blah. You know the story. I'm getting to the end here, folks. We like to find charcoal and food animal bone to help us reconstruct the local economy. The best such deposits are these shell middens that I've mentioned before, where the discarded shell neutralizes soil acid and preserves the animal bone. Luckily, there was a remnant of an indigenous shell midden hanging on to the eastern edge of the Fort St. George landform, right here where the road comes up and turns sharply. It was near where Jeff found the smithy and the iron bloomery. This is a picture of that shell midden. That's from Jeff's excavation. There's a shell layer here and a bunch of sod on top of it. Ceramics from the midden indicate a time range, fairly large time range of occupation. So the shell midden was used for a millennium or two. It's not just before the Europeans arrived. Most of the shell in the midden is soft shell clam. The indigenous people of the ceramic period there were digging clams and consuming them on site. Likely the beach and the flats in Atkins Bay were the place to go to dig clams. There is a small collection of about 100 food animal bone fragments in this shell midden, including deer and plentiful smashed up deer bone sized fragments. So deer hunting was important with follow-up marrow extraction. There's also a large turtle. I haven't been able to identify it. It might be a marine species. And there are the dermal bones of sturgeon, large Atlantic sturgeon, big Atlantic sturgeon, and short-nosed sturgeon. That's a short-nosed sturgeon. So these people were hunting sturgeon or catching them in tidal weirs. The most common bones, however, by a factor of 10 in the midden are codfish. The bones are large. Some of the vertebrae are over an inch in diameter, and that translates into a 30 or 50-pound codfish. Adult cod of that size used to spawn in the spring, April and May, in the deeper inshore channels of Gulf of Maine estuaries, before the Gulf of Maine cod population was decimated by commercial fishing. So spring fishing for large adult cod, presumably in the mouth of the Kennebec, probably with hook and line, baited with clams, was a major activity from the Fort St. George location. These are large cod, folks. I believe this is Newfoundland, and that's probably a 2.5-year-old or 3-year-old kid, but 50 to 100 pounds, some of them. There are multiple other shell middens around the mouth of the Kennebec and the lower Sheepscot, including 5 islands in Georgetown, with similar huge numbers of large adult codfish. So at least during the ceramic period, the area around the mouth of the Kennebec was a spring cod fishing area. We can perhaps reconstruct the clam harvesting and the deer hunting as supporting late winter and early spring activity while people waited there for the codfish to arrive. So, in summary, the Fort St. George Landform was one of the more intensively occupied campgrounds sites at the mouth of the Kennebec. We know the Wabanaki ancestors were doing certain things there for the last couple thousand years. Why people camped there in the more distant past, the warm, dry period up to 7,000 years ago, is unexplained. And then in 1607, the Europeans arrived, and the rest is history. Thank you.